February 18, 1987. Midnight approaches in Effingham, Illinois. The temperature has plummeted to 15 degrees below freezing, and snow blankets the empty parking lot outside the Firefly Grill. Inside his rusted Chevy, Jonathan Robinson turns the key. The engine sputters once, twice before roaring to life. His breath fogs the windshield as he reaches for the ice scraper. The radio crackles with promises of warmer days ahead. He never sees the shadow moving between the cars. He never hears the approaching footsteps muffled by fresh snow. He never makes it home. By sunrise, Jonathan's body lies undiscovered behind the dumpsters, blood frozen in crimson patterns across the asphalt. His wallet remains untouched in his back pocket, his car keys still clutched in his right hand. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more deliberate. For 36 years, the killer walked free among the good people of Effingham. For 36 years, a family waited for answers that never came. For 36 years, Jonathan's case file gathered dust in the evidence room of the Effingham County Sheriff's Department. Until now. A single strand of DNA is about to shatter the silence of a killer who thought they'd gotten away with murder. Jonathan Robinson was the definition of reliability. At 34, he'd worked at the Firefly Grill's industrial kitchen manufacturing division for nearly a decade. Colleagues described him as methodical, punctual, and unfailingly kind. A divorced father of 2 young daughters, Jonathan spent his days welding steel and his evenings coaching Little League. He was, by all accounts, the backbone of his family, a steady presence in an unsteady world. Effingham, Illinois in 1987 was precisely what you'd expect from a Midwestern town of just under 10,000 souls. Located at the crossroads of Interstate 57 and 70, it was a place where people didn't lock their doors at night, where the Friday night high school football games drew crowds larger than Sunday church service, and where everyone knew not just your name, but your parents' names too. The murder of Jonathan Robinson tore through this community like a tornado across flat farmland. Violent crime simply didn't happen here, especially not calculated execution-style killings with no apparent motive. The initial investigation sparked the largest manhunt in Effingham County history. Detectives interviewed over 200 people. They collected dozens of pieces of evidence. They followed every lead and then nothing. For nearly 4 decades, nothing until September 2023, when the Effingham County Sheriff's Department held a press conference that sent shockwaves through the community. Using advanced DNA technology that didn't exist when Jonathan was killed, they had identified his murderer. The arrest that followed left residents reeling because the suspect wasn't some drifter passing through town back in '87. It was someone who had lived among them all this time, someone they trusted, someone they never suspected. Before we dive deeper into this cold case, make sure you're subscribed to catch all our investigations. We explore cases like Jonathan's every week, bringing justice to victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm always fascinated to see how far these stories reach. Now let's turn back the clock to understand the man whose life was cut tragically short that winter night. Jonathan Michael Robinson was born on April 12, 1952, in the heart of the Midwest, Mattoon, Illinois, a small city just 20 minutes west of Effingham. The eldest son of Michael Robinson, a World War II veteran who worked for the Illinois Central Railroad, and Margaret Robinson, a schoolteacher, Jonathan grew up understanding the value of hard work and community. From an early age, Jonathan demonstrated a natural aptitude for working with his hands. While other boys his age were dreaming of becoming astronauts or baseball players, young Jonathan was dismantling radios and rebuilding them in his father's garage. By 12, he had constructed his own go-kart from scavenged parts, a feat that earned him local recognition when the Mattoon Journal-Gazette ran a small feature on the industrious young man. High school wasn't particularly kind to Jonathan. Not academically gifted, he struggled through most subjects except for shop class, where he excelled. His height, 6'2" by his sophomore year, made him an obvious recruit for the basketball team, but his coordination never quite matched his stature. Instead, he found his place in the school's technical theatre program, building sets for plays he would never consider auditioning for. Jonathan could build anything, recalled Tom Whitaker, his former shop teacher, in a 2018 interview with the Effingham Daily News. Give that boy some scrap wood and metal, and he'd hand you back something remarkable. But he was quiet about it, never one to boast. After graduating in 1970, Jonathan briefly attended Eastern Illinois University, but dropped out after 2 semesters. College didn't suit him, and with the Vietnam War raging, he enlisted in the Army. He served from 1971 to 1974 as a mechanic, spending most of his time at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. Thankfully never deploying to the combat zone. It was during his military service that Jonathan met Susan Mitchell, a nurse working at the base hospital. Their courtship was swift and passionate. They married in 1974, just weeks after his honorable discharge, and settled in Effingham, where Susan had family connections. The newlyweds initially lived in a small rental on the north side of town, while Jonathan worked a series of jobs: mechanic at Walker's Auto Shop, maintenance man at St. Anoni's Hospital, and briefly as a carpenter's apprentice. In 1976, the couple welcomed their first daughter, Melissa, followed by Rebecca in 1979. The same year Rebecca was born, Jonathan secured the position that would define his professional life: industrial kitchen equipment fabricator at the Firefly Grill's manufacturing division. The Firefly wasn't just a restaurant. It operated a significant back-end operation that designed and produced commercial kitchen equipment for restaurants throughout the Midwest. Jonathan wasn't just good at his job. He was a cornerstone of our operation, said Frank Dare, his former supervisor, during the 2023 press conference announcing the arrest. He could weld stainless steel like he was stitching silk. We had clients specifically requesting equipment that Jonathan had built because they knew the quality was unmatched. By 1982, Jonathan had been promoted to lead fabricator, overseeing a team of 6 men. The position came with a substantial pay raise, allowing the Robinsons to purchase their first home, a modest 3-bedroom ranch on Maple Street, just 10 minutes from the factory. Photos from this period show a proud Jonathan standing in front of the house, arm wrapped around Susan, their daughters sitting on the porch steps with matching pigtails. But domestic bliss proved fleeting. By 1984, cracks had formed in the Robinson marriage. Colleagues noticed Jonathan taking more overtime shifts, often staying late into the evening. Susan had returned to nursing, working night shifts at the hospital. The couple's incompatible schedules meant they rarely saw each other, and when they did, neighbors recalled hearing arguments. They tried to keep it private, said Elena Weber, who lived next door to the Robinsons for over 20 years. But those walls were thin, and Susan had a voice that carried. It wasn't anything violent, just 2 people who'd fallen out of love but didn't know how to fix it. The divorce was finalized in September 1985. Susan retained the house in primary custody of the girls, while Jonathan moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above Schultz's hardware store downtown. Despite the separation, Jonathan remained deeply involved in his daughters' lives, never missing a weekend visitation and attending every school event from Melissa's spelling bee victories to Rebecca's ballet recital. In fact, Jonathan's dedication to fatherhood became even more pronounced after the divorce. He transformed his small apartment into a space where his daughters felt welcome, with bunk beds in the living room and a collection of board games stacked neatly in the corner. He learned to braid hair by practicing on dolls, a skill that made 7-year-old Rebecca beam with pride. His commitment extended beyond his immediate family. Jonathan volunteered as a little league coach for Melissa's team, the Effingham Eagles. Despite knowing little about baseball, he simply read books on the subject until he felt confident enough to teach the fundamentals. By 1986, the Eagles had won their division championship, and Jonathan was voted Coach of the Year by the Parents Association. At the Firefly, Jonathan's reputation continued to grow. His designs for a new convection oven system had been adopted by the company as their standard model, and there were whispers about a potential patent. Colleagues described him as focused but fair, the kind of supervisor who would stay late to help you finish a project but wouldn't tolerate careless work. Jonathan expected excellence because that's what he delivered, said Marcus Thompson, who worked under Jonathan for 5 years. But he wasn't a taskmaster. If you were having a bad day, he'd be the first to notice and send you home early. Family comes first, he always said. Outside of work and family, Jonathan maintained a small but loyal circle of friends. Sunday afternoons were reserved for fishing at Lake Sarah with his army buddy Dave Carrington. Wednesday nights found him at O'Brien's Tavern for their weekly pool tournament, where he partnered with local dentist Dr. Alan Munro. And the same 5 men gathering around his kitchen table to bet small stakes and share smaller town gossip. Jonathan wasn't particularly religious, though he attended Christmas and Easter services at First Baptist Church to please his mother, who had moved to Effingham after his father's death in 1982. Politics didn't interest him much either. In the Reagan era, Effingham County leaned heavily Republican, but Jonathan's friends recalled him being more concerned with local issues than national ones. He cared about whether the potholes on Jefferson Avenue would get fixed before they swallowed his truck hole. Dave Carrington joked in a 2023 interview, Washington, D.C. might as well have been on another planet. In the months leading up to his murder, several significant developments were unfolding in Jonathan's life. First, he had begun dating again cautiously and discreetly. Her name was Patricia Doyle, a recently divorced administrative assistant at the local credit union. They had met when Jonathan went to apply for a car loan in October 1986. By December, they were seeing each other regularly, though they kept their relationship low-key, especially around the children. Patty was good for him, Susan Robinson told investigators in 2023. I was actually happy he'd found someone. She came to Melissa's basketball game once, and it was nice to see him with someone who seemed to care about the girls too. Second, Jonathan was on the verge of a career breakthrough. The Firefly's parent company, Midwest Kitchen Solutions, had offered him a position at their headquarters in Springfield. A significant promotion that would mean leaving the factory floor for a design office. The salary would be nearly double what he was making, but it would also require relocating, meaning less time with his daughters. According to Patricia, Jonathan was torn about the decision. He wanted to provide better for his girls, maybe save enough for their college funds, she recalled, but the thought of seeing them only once a month instead of weekly was eating him up inside. The third development was perhaps the most immediately relevant to the investigation. 2 weeks before his murder, Jonathan had met with an attorney to discuss potentially seeking joint custody of his daughters. Susan's recent engagement to pharmacist Robert Kaufman had prompted this reconsideration of their arrangement, especially after Melissa, then 10, had expressed anxiety about their family dynamic changing. Whether Susan knew about Jonathan's plans remains unclear. The custody paperwork was found in his apartment after his death, unsigned but complete. The family court later confirmed that no petition had been officially filed. The night before his murder, Jonathan had dinner with Patricia at her apartment. They discussed the Springfield job offer, and according to her statement to police, Jonathan had finally made his decision. He would turn it down and stay in Effingham to be near his children. He planned to call Midwest Kitchen Solutions the following morning to decline their offer. He seemed relieved. Patricia told detectives like a weight had been lifted. He talked about maybe looking for a house to rent, something with a proper bedroom for each of the girls. He was making plans for the future, a future that ended abruptly in a snow-covered parking lot less than 24 hours later. The Jonathan Robinson, who clocked out of his shift at 11:42 p.m. on February 18, 1987, was a man at a crossroads. choosing family over career advancement, stability over change, Effingham over opportunities elsewhere. He punched his time card, exchanged good-natured barbs with the night security guard about the brutal cold, and walked out into the winter night, keys in hand, unaware that someone was waiting for him. Someone who had decided that Jonathan Robinson's story would end that night, February 18, 1987, began like any other Wednesday for Jonathan Robinson. His alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., and despite the temptation to hit snooze in the face of the bitter cold, he rose promptly. The night before, the National Weather Service had issued warnings about an Arctic front moving through central Illinois, with temperatures expected to plummet throughout the day. Jonathan's morning routine rarely varied: a quick shower, a breakfast of instant coffee and toast, and 15 minutes to scrape the previous night's frost from his windshield. By 6:20 a.m., he was pulling into the parking lot of Kaufman's Pharmacy, where his ex-wife's fiancé, Robert, had agreed to let him pick up a prescription before business hours. John came by for his allergy medication. Robert Kaufman later told investigators, "We chatted for maybe 5 minutes about the cold snap. He mentioned he'd be getting the girls this weekend. Asked if Melissa had remembered her science project. Nothing unusual." By 7:15 a.m., Jonathan arrived at the Firefly Grill's manufacturing facility on the outskirts of Effingham. The sprawling complex with its corrugated metal siding and industrial smokestacks contrasted sharply with the quaint restaurant that shared its name downtown. While the Firefly Grill restaurant wouldn't open its doors for another decade, in 1987, the company was already a significant employer in the region, specializing in commercial kitchen equipment. Security logs confirmed Jonathan badged in at 7:18 a.m., stopping briefly to chat with the daytime security guard, Harold Prescott, about the previous night's Chicago Bulls game. The manufacturing floor was already buzzing with activity. The morning shift began at 7 a.m., and Jonathan was responsible for assigning the day's projects to his team. According to multiple witnesses, nothing seemed to miss with Jonathan that morning. He conducted the daily briefing with his usual efficiency, distributing work orders and addressing concerns about a shipment of stainless steel that had arrived with minor defects. "John was John," said Marcus Thompson, one of the welders on his team. "Detail-oriented, fair, focused on getting the job done. He did mention he was considering passing on that Springfield promotion, but he didn't seem stressed about it. If anything, he seemed settled." At 10:30 a.m., phone records show Jonathan made a call from his office to Midwest Kitchen Solutions in Springfield. The call lasted 12 minutes. According to Patricia Doyle, Jonathan had planned to decline the job offer during this conversation. The content of the call remains unknown, as no one was privy to Jonathan's side of the discussion, and the executive he spoke with, Vernon Miles, passed away in 2001 before the case was reopened. Lunch break came at noon. Jonathan didn't typically leave the facility during lunch, preferring to eat at his desk while catching up on paperwork. However, on this particular day, surveillance footage from First National Bank showed Jonathan using the ATM at 12:17 p.m. He withdrew $200, an unusually large amount for him, before returning to work. The afternoon proceeded without incident. Jonathan oversaw the final testing of a custom pizza oven destined for a new restaurant in Chicago, approved 3 design modifications submitted by his team, and conducted a quality check on a shipment scheduled to leave the following morning. At 4:45 p.m., Jonathan received a call from Patricia. According to her statement, they spoke briefly about dinner plans for the coming Friday. She described his mood as upbeat, and said he mentioned having a surprise for her, though he wouldn't elaborate further. The weather, meanwhile, was deteriorating rapidly. By 5 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 11 to grower, with wind chills approaching 10 degrees. The light snow that had been falling intermittently throughout the day began to intensify. Local radio stations were advising residents to stay off the roads if possible. Under normal circumstances, Jonathan's shift would have ended at 5:30 p.m., However, a last-minute order from a St. Louis restaurant chain required immediate attention if it was to ship on schedule. As team leader, Jonathan volunteered to stay late to finish the specifications, telling his crew they could head home. "I offered to stay with him," Marcus Thompson recalled. "But John insisted it was a one-person job, and there was no sense in both of us missing dinner." That was typical John, always putting others first. Security footage captured most of Jonathan's movements throughout the evening. Between 5:45 p.m. and 9:30 p.m., he remained primarily in his office and the adjacent drafting room, emerging occasionally to check reference materials in the factory library or to use the restroom. At 7:22 p.m., he walked to the break room and purchased a sandwich and coffee from the vending machines. At 9:43 p.m., Jonathan made his final phone call of the day to his daughter, Melissa. The call lasted just under 4 minutes. According to Susan, Jonathan called to wish Melissa good luck on her science test the following day. This ordinary act of fatherly encouragement would be the last time his children ever heard his voice. For the next 2 hours, Jonathan worked steadily on the St. Louis specifications. The security cameras captured him, making multiple trips between his office and the prototype area, where he appeared to be taking measurements of an existing oven model similar to the one being ordered. At 11:38 p.m., Jonathan gathered his belongings and shut down his computer. He slipped the completed specifications into his briefcase, a leather portfolio Susan had given him for their 5th anniversary. Security footage showed him buttoning his heavy winter coat, pulling on gloves, and wrapping a scarf around his neck before heading toward the time clock. Jonathan punched out at 11:42 p.m. He exchanged a few words with the night security guard, Walter Dixon, commenting on the brutal cold and asking if the roads had been plowed. Dixon, the last person to see Jonathan alive, recalled nothing unusual about their interaction. John seemed normal, tired after a long day, but not worried or anxious. Dixon stated he joked that his car probably wouldn't start after sitting in the cold all day. "I told him to drive safe, and he walked out." That was it. The parking lot camera captured Jonathan's final moments as he trudged through nearly 6 in of fresh snow toward his car, parked in the far corner of the lot. Factory policy reserved the closer spaces for the morning shift, meaning Jonathan's 1981 Chevrolet Malibu sat almost 200 YD from the building entrance. The footage, grainy and degraded by time, shows Jonathan reaching his vehicle at 11:47 p.m. He appears to brush snow from the driver's side window before inserting his key in the door. At this point, the camera's angle makes it difficult to see clearly, but a shadow moves briefly at the edge of the frame. At 11:49 p.m., Jonathan's car headlights flicker on. They remain illuminated for approximately 30 seconds before going dark again. No cameras captured what happened next. The following morning, February 19th, began with more heavy snowfall. The early shift workers arrived to find the parking lot had been plowed sometime before dawn, creating high banks of snow around the perimeter. Jonathan's Chevrolet, now covered in a fresh layer of powder, attracted no particular attention. Many assumed he had chosen to leave it overnight due to the hazardous driving conditions. At 9:17 a.m., Marcus Thompson, concerned when Jonathan failed to arrive for the morning briefing, tried calling his apartment. When there was no answer, he alerted management, who contacted security to check if Jonathan had perhaps come in through a different entrance. It was Walter Dixon, now ending his overnight shift, who first noticed something amiss. As he made a final perimeter check before clocking out, he spotted what appeared to be a dark shape behind one of the snowbanks near the dumpsters. Upon closer inspection, he discovered Jonathan's body, partially covered by the night's fresh snowfall. Dixon immediately radioed for help and secured the scene. Factory management placed the facility on lockdown at 9:32 a.m., and the first police units arrived 7 minutes later at 9:39 a.m. Officer Dennis Maloney, the first responder on scene, described what he found in his initial report. Victim male identified as Jonathan M. Robinson by factory ID badge, discovered in supine position behind north perimeter dumpster. Body partially covered by snow accumulation. Visible trauma to head and neck area. No signs of life. Wallet present in back pocket containing $32 cash and all ID cards. Keys found clutched in right hand. No obvious signs of robbery. The Effingham County Sheriff's Department took jurisdiction of the case with Detective Samuel Walsh assigned as lead investigator. By 10:15 a.m., the parking lot had been cordoned off with yellow tape, and the county coroner, Dr. Howard Finch, had arrived to pronounce Jonathan officially deceased. Preliminary examination suggested Jonathan had been dead for approximately 8 to 10 hours, placing the time of death between 11:45 p.m. and 1:45 a.m. The cause of death appeared to be multiple stab wounds to the neck and upper torso, though the full autopsy would later reveal additional injuries. Most telling was the lack of defensive wounds on Jonathan's hands or arms, suggesting he had been attacked suddenly with no opportunity to fight back. The position of his body nearly 50 yards from his car indicated he had either been moved after the attack or had managed to stagger that distance before collapsing. By noon, the scene had transformed into a full-scale criminal investigation. Sheriff Robert Milligan himself arrived to oversee operations, an unusual step that underscored the shocking nature of the crime in this small community. Deputies conducted a grid search of the entire parking lot, hampered by both the fresh snow and the earlier plowing, which had potentially destroyed crucial evidence. Inside the factory, Detective Walsh and his team began the painstaking process of interviewing all employees who had been present the previous evening. Security footage was secured, though its quality, especially the external cameras affected by the snowfall, left much to be desired. News of the murder spread quickly through Effingham. By mid-afternoon, local radio stations were broadcasting the first reports, careful to include only the information officially released by the Sheriff's Department. A male employee had been found deceased outside the Firefly manufacturing facility. Foul play was suspected, and an investigation was underway for Susan Robinson. The notification came in the worst possible way. While picking up Melissa from school at 3:15 p.m., she overheard parents discussing the murder. Only when she recognized Jonathan's car being described in their whispered conversation did she realize the victim was her ex-husband. A frantic call to the Sheriff's Department led to a deputy being dispatched to officially inform her. But the damage was already done. Susan had to explain to her daughters that their father would never be coming home again. As darkness fell on February 19th, the Effingham County Sheriff's Department faced the daunting task of solving a murder with limited physical evidence, no apparent motive, and no witnesses. What they didn't know then was that this investigation was just beginning a journey that would span more than 3 decades, outlast multiple sheriffs, and ultimately require scientific techniques not yet invented to finally bring Jonathan Robinson's killer to justice. The murder of Jonathan Robinson thrust the Effingham County Sheriff's Department into their most complex homicide investigation in decades. Sheriff Robert Milligan, a 20-year veteran with only 2 previous murder cases on his record, both straightforward domestic incidents with confessions, found himself facing a crime that would test the limits of 1987's investigative capabilities. "We were out of our depth, and I'm not too proud to admit that now," Milligan confessed in a 2023 interview. "But we threw everything we had at this case because John deserved justice and this community deserved answers." The first 48 hours of any murder investigation are critical, and Detective Samuel Walsh understood this all too well. He established a command center in the Firefly's conference room, where a team of 6 deputies worked in shifts around the clock. Their initial focus, collecting and preserving what little physical evidence had survived the night's snowfall and subsequent plowing. Crime scene technicians faced substantial challenges. The freezing temperatures had preserved some evidence. Blood patterns remained largely intact beneath the snow, but the same cold made fingerprint recovery nearly impossible on exposed metal surfaces. The snow itself was both blessing and curse. While it had covered and protected some evidence, it had also obscured footprints and potentially washed away trace evidence. Nevertheless, the team methodically processed the scene, collecting the presumed murder weapon, a hunting knife with a 6-in blade, found partially buried in a snowbank approximately 20 yards from Jonathan's body. The handle had been wiped clean, but blood in the blade's serrations matched Jonathan's type. This was before DNA testing was readily available. Tire impressions from a vehicle that had apparently parked briefly beside the dumpsters, not in a designated space, suggesting someone may have waited there. Due to the snow accumulation and subsequent plowing, only partial impressions were recoverable. A cigarette butt of an uncommon brand, Dunhill International, found near where the vehicle had parked. Jonathan wasn't a smoker, and none of the Facto's employees interviewed claimed to smoke that premium brand. Fibers from Jonathan's clothing, which showed signs of a struggle despite the lack of defensive wounds on his hands. The autopsy would later confirm that he had been immobilized somehow before being stabbed. A single partial footprint in blood size 11 that didn't match Jonathan's work boots. The tread pattern suggested a common work boot brand sold widely throughout the Midwest. The autopsy conducted by Dr. Howard Finch on February 20th revealed several critical details. Jonathan had suffered 7 stab wounds to the neck and torso, with the fatal blow severing his carotid artery. Defensive wounds were minimal, suggesting he had been incapacitated quickly. Most significant was the discovery of a needle puncture mark on his upper arm with toxicology reports, later confirming the presence of a powerful sedative in his system. Someone drugged him first, Dr. Finch explained in his report. The sedative would have taken effect within seconds of injection, explaining the lack of defensive wounds and the absence of a prolonged struggle. This finding transformed the investigation. What had initially appeared to be a crime of opportunity or passion now clearly indicated premeditation. Someone had planned to kill Jonathan Robinson, had brought both a syringe and a knife to ensure success. With this disturbing revelation, Detective Walsh expanded his suspect pool. The entire workforce of the Firefly was interviewed with particular attention, paid to anyone with medical training who might have access to sedatives. Background checks were run on all 172 employees, looking for criminal histories or connections to Jonathan beyond the workplace. Several potential suspects emerged. Marcus Thompson, the welder who worked directly under Jonathan, and would have been in line for his position if Jonathan had accepted the Springfield promotion. Thompson had initially offered to stay late with Jonathan, but was told to go home. His alibi was confirmed by multiple witnesses, including the bartender, Vernon Miles, the executive from Midwest Kitchen Solutions, who had spoken with Jonathan about the Springfield position. Phone records confirmed Miles was in Springfield at the time of the murder, and his credit card statement showed him dining at a restaurant there until 10:30 p.m., making it physically impossible for him to reach Effingham by the time of Jonathan's death. Robert Kaufman, Susan's fiancé, who had a more complicated relationship with Jonathan than initially portrayed. Several witnesses reported seeing the two men arguing outside Melissa's school 2 weeks before the murder. Kaufman claimed the disagreement was minor about Melissa's upcoming birthday party, but others characterized it as heated. However, Kaufman had an airtight alibi. He was working the night shift at the hospital pharmacy, confirmed by security footage and multiple colleagues. Harold Mercer, a recently fired employee who had threatened Jonathan during his termination meeting in January. Mercer had a record of misdemeanor assault and was known to have a volatile temper. When questioned, Mercer admitted to being angry, but insisted he'd been in Chicago visiting his brother the night of the murder. This alibi was initially corroborated by the brother, but later fell apart when investigators discovered the brother had been working an overnight shift and couldn't have been with Mercer. As the investigation entered its second week, Harold Mercer became the primary focus. His shaky alibi, history of violence, and direct conflict with Jonathan made him the most viable suspect. On February 28th, deputies executed a search warrant on Mercer's apartment, looking specifically for the unique Dunhill cigarettes and any clothing that might contain traces of Jonathan's blood. The search yielded nothing conclusive. While Mercer did own similar work boots to those that left the bloody print, the size and wear patterns didn't match. No Dunhill cigarettes were found, nor any clothing with suspicious stains. Most damning to the case against him, Mercer had no medical training, and investigators could find no evidence of how he might have obtained a controlled sedative. Still, lacking better leads, the sheriff's department brought Mercer in for formal questioning on March 3rd. For 6 hours, detectives pressed him on his whereabouts, his feelings toward Jonathan, and inconsistencies in his alibi. Mercer maintained his innocence throughout, growing increasingly hostile as the interrogation continued. Without sufficient evidence for an arrest, they were forced to release him. "That was our lowest point," Detective Walsh recalled. "We had a suspect who fit parts of the profile, but nothing concrete to tie him to the scene. Meanwhile, the community was growing restless, and Susan was calling daily for updates we couldn't provide." As March turned to April, fresh leads dried up. The case file grew thicker with interview transcripts and lab reports, but no conclusive evidence emerged. The knife, despite being the murder weapon, yielded no fingerprints or traceable origin. It was a mass-reduced hunting knife sold in sporting goods stores throughout Illinois. The investigation reached even further when a potential connection to an unsolved murder indicator emerged. In 1985, another factory worker had been stabbed in a parking lot under similar circumstances, though without the sedative component. Detective Walsh spent 2 weeks exploring this angle, only to ultimately rule out any connection when the Decatur victim was linked to local drug trafficking, something completely absent from Jonathan's life. By summer, the sheriff's department was forced to scale back the active investigation. Detective Walsh remained dedicated, interviewing new employees at the Firefly, re-examining witness statements, and periodically checking on Harold Mercer, who had since moved to Springfield. But with each passing month, the trail grew colder. Perhaps the most heartbreaking dead end came in November 1987, 9 months after the murder. An anonymous caller to the department's newly established tip line claimed to have information about what really happened to the factory worker. A meeting was arranged at a truck stop outside town, but the informant never showed. Despite staking out the location for 3 consecutive nights, detectives made no contact. The caller's identity and whatever information they possessed remained a mystery. The first anniversary of Jonathan's death was marked by a small gathering at First Baptist Church where Susan, the girls, and about 30 friends and colleagues shared memories of the man whose murder remained unsolved. Sheriff Milligan attended, offering what reassurance he could that the case remained open. What he didn't share was how thin the file had grown, how few new leads had emerged in months. By 1990, the Jonathan Robinson case had been officially classified as cold. Detective Walsh had been promoted to chief deputy, overseeing other investigations while still periodically revisiting Jonathan's file. The murder weapon remained in evidence storage along with blood samples, fibers, and that lone cigarette butt. Items that would one day speak volumes when science finally caught up with the crime. What time is it where you're watching? Our investigators worked around the clock to solve this case, following leads day and night for months before it eventually went cold. The dedication these detectives showed, even when technology couldn't match their determination, laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most remarkable cold case breakthroughs in Illinois history. Drop the time and your location in the comments below, and imagine receiving that midnight call that would finally crack this case wide open. By 1991, The Jonathan Robinson case file had been transferred to a storage room at the Effingham County Sheriff's Department, joining other unsolved crimes in a section officers grimly referred to as the dead files. This wasn't from lack of effort. The initial investigation had consumed thousands of man-hour, generated hundreds of leads, and included interviews with nearly everyone who knew Jonathan. Yet the case had stalled for several critical reasons. First and foremost was the limitation of forensic technology. In 1987, DNA analysis existed but remained rudimentary, expensive, and time-consuming. The FBI's DNA database wouldn't be operational until 1998. Blood typing and fingerprinting were the primary forensic tools available, and both had yielded nothing conclusive in Jonathan's case. We knew the killer had likely left DNA at the scene. Former Sheriff Milligan explained years later, but we had no way to analyze it properly, let alone compare it to potential suspects. It was like having a lock without a key. Second was the crime scene itself. The combination of freezing temperatures, snowfall, and the subsequent plowing had compromised what might have been crucial evidence. Footprints, tire tracks, and trace evidence had been altered or destroyed before investigators fully understood their significance. Third was the apparent randomness of the crime. Despite exhaustive background checks, detectives found no one with sufficient motive to murder Jonathan. He had no significant enemies, wasn't involved in any illegal activities, and had no large life insurance policies that might benefit someone from his death. Harold Mercer, the fired employee who had been their prime suspect, eventually moved to Kentucky in 1992. Two detectives traveled there to interview him again, but found nothing to advance the case. With his departure, the investigation lost its last tangible lead. For Effingham, population 9,800, the unsolved murder cast a long shadow. A community once known for unlocked doors now saw deadbolts installed throughout neighborhoods. Parents who had allowed children to play unsupervised began implementing strict curfews. The Firefly installed enhanced security systems, added lighting to their parking lot, and hired an additional night guard. Local newspapers, which had once featured weekly updates on the investigation, gradually reduced coverage to occasional mentions on anniversaries of the murder. The Effingham Daily News ran a 5-year retrospective in 1992 titled "Justice Delayed the Unsolved Murder of Jonathan Robinson." But by the 10th anniversary, the story warranted only a small item on page 7. For Susan Robinson and her daughters, the lack of resolution proved an ongoing trauma. While Susan remarried in 1989, becoming Susan Kaufman, she remained active in keeping Jonathan's case alive. Each February, she placed the same advertisement in the local paper, a photo of Jonathan with the text, "Someone knows what happened. Please come forward." Melissa and Rebecca Robinson grew up in the shadow of their father's unsolved murder. Melissa, in particular, channeled her grief into action. As a high school senior in 1994, she organized a community awareness campaign about the case, distributing flyers with case details and establishing a small reward fund using money from her after-school job. "I barely remember my dad," she told the school newspaper, "but I know he deserves justice and my sister and I deserve answers." The case saw periodic revivals over the years. In 1993, when a similar murder occurred in neighboring Jasper County, comparisons were made to Jonathan's case, but the Jasper County killer was caught quickly and no connection was established. In 1997, Detective Walsh, now approaching retirement, made a final push on the case. He re-interviewed key witnesses, including Walter Dixon, the security guard, who had last seen Jonathan alive. Dixon, suffering from early-stage dementia, offered a new detail. He thought he remembered seeing a dark-colored truck in the parking lot earlier that evening. This potential lead was investigated, but ultimately proved fruitless. When Dixon's recollection was deemed unreliable due to his condition, a more significant attempt came in 2001 when Sheriff Timothy Leaire, who had been a junior deputy during the original investigation, created the department's first cold case unit. Jonathan's case was their inaugural focus. This team digitized the entire case file, re-examined physical evidence, and consulted with the newly established Illinois State Police Forensic Science Laboratory about potential DNA testing. The results were disappointing. Many biological samples had degraded due to improper storage methods common in the 1980s. The cigarette butt found near the scene yielded only a partial DNA profile, enough to exclude some suspects, but insufficient for positive identification or database matching. Patricia Doyle, who had been dating Jonathan at the time of his murder, relocated to Arizona in 1989, but continued to contact the sheriff's department annually for updates. In 2004, she funded a billboard on Interstate 57 with Jonathan's photo and information about the case. It generated several tips, all of which led nowhere. By 2010, the Robinson case exemplified the heartbreaking reality of cold cases. Those who had known Jonathan best were aging or deceased. Vernon Miles, the Springfield executive, who had offered him the promotion, died in 2001. Walter Dixon, the security guard, passed in 1999. Even Detective Walsh, the case's most dedicated investigator, retired in 2008 after a heart attack limited his ability to work. The evidence remained in storage. The file gathered dust, and for many in Effingham, the murder became a historical footnote rather than an ongoing investigation. Many newer residents had never even heard of Jonathan Robinson or the impact his death had once had on their community. For Rebecca and Melissa Robinson, now adults with families of their own, their father's case seemed destined to remain unsolved. In 2012, on the 25th anniversary of the murder, they held a small memorial service at Jonathan's grave. Only 12 people attended. The case that had once dominated headlines had faded from public consciousness, joining the thousands of unsolved murders that haunt American communities. What no one could have predicted was that the solution to this decades-old mystery was waiting in a small cardboard box in the evidence room, waiting for science to catch up with justice. The evidence from Jonathan Robinson's murder scene, a hunting knife with traces of blood, a cigarette butt, and several fabric samples sat in the Effingham County Sheriff's Department evidence room for decades. These items, sealed in paper bags and cardboard boxes, remained largely untouched as the world of forensic science underwent a revolution around them. In 1987, when Jonathan was killed, DNA analysis existed, but remained in its infancy. The technique had been used in a criminal case for the first time just 1 year earlier, when British investigators used DNA fingerprinting to solve a double homicide in Learshire, England. At that time, DNA testing required substantial amounts of biological material, took weeks to process, and cost thousands of dollars per sample. Back then, we collected blood evidence primarily for blood typing. AB, or O, explained Dr. Marguerite Winters, who served as the Illinois State Police's Forensic Division Director from UF 1995 to 2008. That could exclude some suspects, but couldn't definitively identify a perpetrator the way modern DNA analysis can. The first major shift came in 1989 with the development of the polymerase chain reaction PCR technique, which allowed scientists to make millions of copies of DNA segments from tiny samples. Suddenly, evidence that contained minimal biological material, a few skin cells, a drop of blood or saliva on a cigarette butt, held potential evidentiary value. By 1994, the Illinois State Police had established a DNA laboratory in Springfield, joining the growing national network of forensic DNA facilities. That same year, the federal government passed the DNA Identification Act, authorizing the FBI to establish the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, unsolved crime scenes, and missing persons. For cold cases like Jonathan's, these developments offered new hope. Throughout the 1990s, law enforcement agencies nationwide began re-examining unsolved murders with preserved biological evidence. The Effingham County Sheriff's Department submitted samples from Jonathan's case to the state lab in 1997, but the results were disappointing. The cigarette butt yielded only a partial profile, noted the lab report. Insufficient for CODIS upload or conclusive identification. Blood samples from the knife blade too degraded for reliable analysis. This was a common problem with evidence collected before DNA testing became standard. Storage methods that seemed adequate in the 1980s, plastic bags, uncontrolled temperature environments, minimal protection against contamination, often compromised biological material over time. The next quantum leap came in the early 2000s with the development of short tandem repeat STR analysis, a technique that examined specific regions of DNA where short sequences repeat themselves. This method required even less DNA and provided more discriminating results. By 2003, the standard CODIS profile examined 13 STR locations, creating a profile that was statistically unique. The odds of two unrelated individuals sharing the same 13 locus profile were approximately 1 in 1 trillion. In 2008, the Robinson case saw its second forensic review when Sheriff James Custer, newly elected and determined to solve the department's most notorious cold case, ordered all evidence resubmitted to the now advanced state laboratory. This time the results showed modest improvement. Using enhanced extraction techniques, technicians obtained a complete STR profile from the cigarette butt. This profile was uploaded to CODIS, but no match was found, meaning the DNA didn't belong to anyone in the offender database. The knife blade, when tested with more sensitive equipment, revealed a mixture of at least 2 DNA profiles, Jonathan's and an unknown contributor. "We were closer," Sheriff Custer recalled in a 2023 interview. "We had the killer's DNA. We just didn't know who it belonged to. Without a suspect to compare it against or a CODIS hit, we remained at a standstill." The case stalled again until 2018, when a revolutionary new approach to forensic DNA analysis emerged: investigative genetic genealogy. This technique had captured public attention earlier that year, when it identified the Golden State Killer, a serial murderer who had terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s. Investigative genetic genealogy works differently from traditional forensic DNA analysis. Rather than looking at just 1320 specific markers used by law enforcement databases, it examines hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across the genome. These comprehensive profiles can then be compared against public genetic genealogy databases, where individuals have voluntarily uploaded their DNA results from ancestry testing companies. When a partial match is found, it indicates a potential familial relationship. Perhaps not the perpetrator directly, but a cousin, a second cousin, or even a more distant relative. Genealogists can then build family trees, working backward to find common ancestors, and then forward again to identify possible suspects who fit the profile of the criminal. It's like using DNA to create a map that leads you to the perpetrator's front door, explained Dr. Eleanor Martinez, a genetic genealogist who has worked on dozens of cold cases. The DNA might match to a third cousin twice removed. By building out that person's family tree and combining it with traditional investigative methods, we can identify candidates for further investigation. The technique is time-intensive and requires specialized expertise in both genealogical research and criminal investigation. It also raises privacy concerns, as people who submit DNA to ancestry companies rarely anticipate their genetic information being used to identify relatives involved in crimes. Despite these challenges, by 2020, investigative genetic genealogy had solved over 100 cold cases nationwide. Its success caught the attention of Detective Aaron Blackwell, a young officer with the Effingham County Sheriff's Department who had developed an interest in the Robinson case after finding the file during a storage room reorganization project. I was born the year Jonathan Robinson was killed. Blackwell noted, growing up in Effingham, I'd heard about the case my whole life. Reading through that file, seeing the impact this murder had on our community, I became determined to solve it. Blackwell spent 6 months researching investigative genetic genealogy and building a proposal for Sheriff Coaster. The technique was expensive, potentially costing $5,000, $20,000, depending on the complexity of the case, and success wasn't guaranteed. But the Robinson case had several factors in its favor: preserved DNA evidence, a complete unknown profile from the cigarette butt, and the partial profile from the murder weapon. In January 2021, with the sheriff's approval, Blackwell reached out to Evolutionary Forensics, a private lab specializing in extracting DNA from aged or degraded samples. The cigarette butt and blood evidence from the knife were carefully packaged and shipped to their facility in San Diego. Using advanced extraction methods, the lab successfully obtained enough DNA from both samples to confirm they came from the same person and to generate a comprehensive genetic profile suitable for genealogical comparison. This profile was then uploaded to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. Promising. Several distant matches appeared primarily in the 3rd and 4th cousin range. Blackwell contracted with Safe Ancestry, a company employing genetic genealogists who specialize in law enforcement cases, to begin the painstaking process of building family trees. For 4 months, genealogists worked backward through time, identifying common ancestors among the matches. The DNA pointed toward a family with roots in southern Illinois, dating back to the 1850s. From there, they worked forward, identifying all descendants who would be the right age, gender and location to be potential suspects. "It's like a massive puzzle," said Catherine Fleming, the lead genealogist on the case. "We built out over 2,000 individuals across dozens of family branches. Eventually, we narrowed our focus to 3 family lines that intersected in Effingham County during the 1980s. By September 2021, Safe Ancestry delivered a report to Detective Blackwell containing a list of 12 men who descended from the identified family lines, were between 25 years old in 1987, had connections to Effingham County during the relevant time period. The list included names both familiar and surprising. 3 were already in the case file, having been interviewed during the original investigation. 4 had criminal records for unrelated offenses. 1 was deceased, and several had connections to the Firefly that hadn't been previously established. Blackwell began the methodical process of investigating each name on the list, careful to avoid tipping off potential suspects. Through background checks, interviews with associates, and discreet surveillance, he sought to eliminate candidates or develop sufficient evidence for a DNA search warrant. "We had to move carefully," Blackwell explained. "If the killer realized we were closing in, crucial evidence might disappear, but we also couldn't rush and risk making an accusation against an innocent person." The genealogy narrowed our focus dramatically, but traditional detective work was still essential. By December 2021, the list had been narrowed to 3 prime suspects. Each had connections to Jonathan Robinson, no solid alibi for the night of February 18, 1987, and continued to live in or near Effingham County. The challenge now was obtaining DNA samples for comparison without alerting them to the investigation. For 2 months, Blackwell conducted surveillance operations, collecting discarded items that might contain DNA. Coffee cups from restaurants, cigarette butts from outside workplaces, even sweat-soaked bandanas from a local gym. Each sample was carefully documented and submitted to the Illinois State Police Forensic Science Laboratory for comparison against the profile from the original evidence. The first 2 suspects were eliminated through this process. Their DNA didn't match the cigarette butt or the unknown profile from the knife. But the 3rd suspect remained elusive, more careful with personal items, less public in his movements, harder to obtain a sample from without direct contact. In March 2022, after consultation with the Effingham County State's Attorney, Blackwell obtained a warrant for a direct DNA sample from the remaining suspect, based on the genealogical connection and circumstantial evidence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would finally bring resolution to one of Effingham's most notorious, unsolved crimes. 36 years after Jonathan Robinson's murder, science had finally caught up with his killer. The same evidence that had sat silently in storage for decades was about to speak with stunning clarity, naming the person who had waited in the snowy parking lot on that February night in 1987. March 16, 2022, began like any other day for Detective Aaron Blackwell. A quick briefing with Sheriff Coaster, paperwork from ongoing cases, and a scheduled interview with a shoplifting suspect. But at 10:17 a.m., his cell phone rang with a call that would change everything. Detective Blackwell, this is Dr. Lauren Reeves from the Illinois State Police Forensic Science Laboratory. I think you're going to want to come to Springfield immediately. We have a match on the Robinson case. Blackwell, who had been living and breathing the Robinson investigation for nearly 18 months, felt his heart race. A CODIS hit, he asked, assuming someone in the offender database had finally matched the cigarette butt DNA. No, Dr. Reeves replied. The sample you submitted last week, the coffee cup from Martin's Diner, it's a match to both the cigarette butt and the partial profile from the knife. We're talking a probability of 1 in 1.3 trillion. This isn't close. This is conclusive. The coffee cup belonged to Richard Thornton, a 63-year-old retired maintenance supervisor who had worked at the Firefly manufacturing facility from 1982 to 2015. Thornton wasn't among the original suspects in 1987, though interviewed as part of the factory-wide canvass. He had provided an alibi that was never thoroughly vetted, claiming to be home with his wife, who corroborated his story. More troubling, Thornton had been hiding in plain sight for decades. He had attended Jonathan's funeral, participated in the Facto's memorial fundraiser for the Robinson daughters' education, and even served on a community safety committee formed in the wake of the murder. All while knowing exactly what had happened in that snowy parking lot. The path to identifying Thornton had been methodical and scientifically groundbreaking, representing the culmination of both technological advancement and dogged investigation. When Safe Ancestry submitted their genetic genealogy report in September 2021, they had identified 3 distinct family branches that converged in Effingham County. The genetic marker suggested the unknown DNA contributor was descended from Jacob and Mary Thornton, who had settled in Illinois in 1872 and had 7 children. By the 1980s, their descendants numbered in the hundreds scattered throughout the Midwest. The Safe Ancestry team constructed elaborate family trees, working forward through time to identify all male descendants who would have been adults in 1987 and had connections to Effingham County. Richard Thornton emerged as one of 12 possibilities. Initial background research revealed several interesting facts. He had worked at the Firefly during the relevant time period, had a hunting license, potentially significant given the murder weapon was a hunting knife, and had taken a 6-week medical technician course in 1983, potentially giving him knowledge of injections and sedatives. What truly elevated him on the suspect list was his reaction to Jonathan's promotion opportunity. Buried in the original case file was a single sentence from his 1987 interview. Thornton expressed surprise at Robinson being considered for Springfield position, noted several more experienced employees had been passed over. This hadn't seemed significant at the time, but viewed through the lens of a potential motive, it took on new meaning. Further investigation revealed Thornton had applied for a transfer to Springfield twice in the early 1980s and been rejected both times. Over the following months, Detective Blackwell painstakingly investigated all 12 names on the list. 8 were quickly eliminated. 4 had ironclad alibis for the night of the murder, 3 had DNA samples that didn't match, and 1 had been misidentified in the family tree research. That left 4 men, including Thornton. Obtaining surreptitious DNA samples proved challenging. 2 suspects were eliminated when their DNA didn't match the evidence. The 3rd moved to Florida during the investigation, making sample collection impractical. Thornton remained the prime focus. After weeks of surveillance, Blackwell finally got his opportunity on March 10, 2022. Thornton had a morning routine that included breakfast at Martin's Diner every Thursday. On this particular Thursday, Blackwell arranged for an unmarked officer to be seated at the counter next to Thornton's usual booth. After Thornton finished his meal and left, the officer signaled to the waitress who had been briefed on the operation. She preserved Thornton's coffee cup in an evidence bag before clearing the table. The cup with saliva on the rim provided a perfect DNA sample without alerting Thornton to the investigation. 6 days later, the lab confirmed what genetic genealogy had suggested. Richard Thornton's DNA matched the 35-year-old evidence from Jonathan Robinson's murder scene. With this breakthrough, the investigative team gathered in Sheriff Coas's office to determine next steps. Present were Blackwell Coaster, State's Attorney Martha Wilson, and Illinois State Police Lieutenant James Hartman, who had been brought in to assist with the high-profile case. "I remember just sitting there in silence for a moment," Sheriff Coaster recalled. 35 years, generations of deputies had worked this case, and now we had our answer. It was overwhelming. The DNA match alone was compelling, but prudent investigation required building a complete case. Over the next 3 weeks, the team worked to establish the connection between Thornton and the crime beyond genetic evidence. They discovered Thornton had been responsible for the maintenance sector that included Jonathan's fabrication area. They worked in proximity with Thornton's workshop, located just 30 FT from Jonathan's office. Several former employees re-entered, mentioned tensions between the 2 men over equipment repairs and maintenance schedules. More significantly, payroll records revealed Thornton had been passed over for promotion 3 times. Between 1983 and 1986, while Jonathan's career had advanced steadily. The Springfield position that Jonathan had been offered, and ultimately we began seeing a clear picture of resentment building over years, Blackwell explained. Thornton viewed himself as more experienced and deserving, yet repeatedly watched Jonathan succeed where he had failed. The most damning non-genetic evidence came from Patricia Doyle, Jonathan's girlfriend at the time of the murder. When shown a recent photograph of Thornton, she immediately recognized him. "That's the maintenance guy who was always hanging around Jay's department. I remember him staring at us once, when John walked me to my car after meeting me for lunch at the factory." John laughed it off, said Richard was just socially awkward, but something about him made me uncomfortable. With the DNA match, motive, opportunity, and witness statements connecting Thornton to Jonathan, the team secured arrest and search warrants on April 7, 2022. The operation was planned meticulously. Thornton was a hunter with multiple registered firearms, and despite his age, posed a potential threat if cornered. The arrest took place at 6:15 a.m. on April 8th, with a tactical team surrounding Thornton's modest ranch house on the outskirts of Effingham. He surrendered without incident, appearing genuinely shocked when informed of the charges. The search of his home yielded the final pieces of the puzzle. In a locked gun safe in the basement, officers discovered a box containing newspaper clippings about Jonathan's murder. Every article published over 35 years, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Beneath the clippings was a Firefly employee ID badge belonging to Jonathan Robinson, an item never listed among his missing possessions because no one knew he had it with him that night. Finding that badge was when it truly hit me. Detective Blackwell said, "This wasn't just a cold case we'd solved through science. This was a human being who had harbored his deadly secret for decades, who had collected souvenirs and news stories about his crime, who had watched Jonathan's daughters grow up without their father while he lived his life in freedom." For the investigative team, The breakthrough represented more than just professional accomplishment. It validated the work of generations of officers who had maintained the integrity of the evidence, documented their findings meticulously, and never completely abandoned the hope that someday, somehow, Jonathan Robinson's killer would be identified. "I called Sam Walsh that day," Sheriff Coaster recounted, referring to the now retired detective who had led the original investigation. "He's 85 now, living in a nursing home in Mayton. When I told him we'd arrested Richard Thornton for Jonathan's murder, he wept. I interviewed him. He kept saying, I looked him in the eyes and didn't see it." The scientific breakthrough that ultimately solved the case, investigative genetic genealogy, represented the convergence of multiple disciplines: forensic science, genealogical research, database technology, and traditional detective work. A cigarette discarded in a snowy parking lot in 1987 had finally spoken, its DNA revealing connections across generations and leading investigators directly to a killer who thought he had committed the perfect crime. In a twist of meteorological symbolism, not lost on the investigative team, the week of Thornton's arrest saw unusual weather patterns across central Illinois. A stubborn cold front that had gripped the region for weeks finally broke, sending temperatures soaring from the 30s to the 70s in a matter of days. What's the weather like where you are in Illinois? A cold front was breaking just as this case was heating up. After 35 years in the shadows, the truth about what happened to Jonathan Robinson was about to be exposed to the warm light of justice. Drop a comment letting us know your current weather and whether you had already figured out that the killer must have been someone from within the Firefly itself. The genetic genealogy results had provided Detective Blackwell with 12 potential suspects, all male descendants of the Thornton family line, who had connections to Effingham County during the 1980s. While this narrowed the field dramatically from the hundreds of individuals initially considered, identifying the specific killer required methodical elimination and confirmation. Of the 12 names, 5 immediately stood out because they had direct connections to the Firefly manufacturing facility. 2 had been temporary workers during summer months in the mid-1980s. 1 had delivered supplies to the factory regularly, but never worked there directly. Another had been employed in the front office until 1985, before relocating to Missouri. And then there was the maintenance supervisor, a quiet, unremarkable man who had spent his entire career at the Firefly, rising from janitor to supervisor over a 33-year tenure before retiring in 2015. When I first pulled his employment file, nothing jumped out at me, Blackwell recalled. He had a clean record with the company, perfect attendance, regular promotions early in his career, then a plateau at the supervisor level. Nothing to suggest he was capable of murder. The suspect had been born in 1959 in the neighboring town of Altamont, the third of 5 children in a working-class family. His father worked at the railroad yard, his mother as a seamstress. Former classmates described him as quiet, a loner and smart but not ambitious. After high school, he attended community college for 1 year before dropping out and taking a series of maintenance jobs. In 1982, he was hired at the Firefly as a maintenance worker. His personnel file showed steady progression from basic maintenance to specialized equipment repair, then to assistant supervisor by 1986. His performance reviews consistently rated him as meets expectations or exceeds expectations, with particular praise for his attention to detail and technical knowledge. On paper, he looked like a model employee, Sheriff Coaster noted, but when we dug deeper into his personnel file, we found subtle indicators of someone who might have harbored resentments. Those indicators included 3 denied requests for promotion to positions outside the maintenance department between 1983 and 1986. Each rejection letter cited his valuable contributions to current department and specialized technical skills, corporate language that essentially meant they wanted him to stay where he was. The last rejection, dated November 1986, was for a position in the Springfield headquarters. The same opportunity later offered to Jonathan Robinson. This potential motive aligned with comments in the original case file. In his 1987 interview, the suspect had mentioned feeling that certain employees received preferential treatment and that politics, not performance, determined advancement at the Firefly. Though he hadn't been flagged as suspicious at the time, these statements took on new significance in light of the genetic connection. More telling was his proximity to Jonathan on the night of the murder. The original employee sign-out log showed the suspect had worked until 10 Ballard p.m. on February 18, 1987, less than 2 hours before Jonathan was killed. His stated reason for staying late: routine maintenance on fabrication equipment. This gave him both opportunity and familiarity with Jonathan's schedule. As maintenance supervisor, he would have known Jonathan was working late alone that night. He would have had access to all areas of the facility, including the parking lot where the murder occurred. The suspect's background offered other relevant details. He was an avid hunter with hunting licenses dating back to 1975, explaining potential familiarity with the type of knife used in the murder. More significantly, in 1983 he had completed a 6-week emergency medical technician course offered through the company's professional development program. That EMT training was a key detail, Blackwell explained. It gave him knowledge of how to administer injections and potentially access to sedatives. The autopsy had shown Jonathan was immobilized with a sedative before being stabbed, a detail never released to the public. As compelling as these circumstantial connections were, DNA evidence would provide the definitive link. Obtaining that sample without alerting the suspect required careful planning. We considered several approaches, Lieutenant Hartman of the Illinois State Police explained. A traffic stop, where we might collect a discarded cigarette, posing as marketing researchers offering water samples in his neighborhood, even examining his garbage for discarded items. But all of these had potential legal complications or risked tipping him off. The breakthrough came when Blackwell's surveillance revealed the suspect's Thursday morning ritual. For over a decade, he had eaten breakfast at Martin's Diner, always sitting at the same booth, always ordering the same meal. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, always between 7:15 and 800 a.m. On March 10, 2022, an unmarked officer took a seat at the counter, adjacent to the suspect's regular booth. The waitress, briefly informed that police needed to collect evidence, but not told why, agreed to carefully preserve his coffee cup after he left. At 7:52 a.m., the suspect paid his bill and departed. The waitress immediately secured his coffee cup in an evidence bag, handling it by the bottom, only to avoid contaminating potential DNA on the rim where his lips had touched. The sample was immediately transported to the Illinois State Police Forensic Science Laboratory in Springfield. Lauren Reeves, the lead forensic scientist, prioritized its analysis. Using short tandem repeat STR analysis, her team compared the DNA profile from the coffee cup to the profiles developed from both the cigarette butt found at the murder scene and the partial profile from the knife handle. The results were unequivocal. All 3 profiles matched with a random match probability of 1 in 1.3 trillion. In non-scientific terms, it was mathematically certain that the same person who drank from that coffee cup in 2022 had smoked a cigarette at the murder, seen and handled the knife that killed Jonathan Robinson in 1987. When those results came in, I felt this strange combination of elation and solemnity, Dr. Reeves later recalled. Scientifically, it was a perfect match, as definitive as DNA evidence gets, but humanly, it meant we had finally identified someone who had walked free for 35 years after committing murder. With the DNA match established, Blackwell and his team needed to construct a complete profile of the suspect, now confirmed as their killer. They re-examined every mention of him in the original case file, interviewed former co-workers, and delved into his life during and after 1987. A disturbing pattern emerged of a man who had inserted himself into the aftermath of the crime. Not only had he attended Jonathan's funeral, but he had been photographed helping to carry the casket as one of the pallbearers, a role typically reserved for family and close friends. In the months following the murder, he had participated actively in the factory safety committee, formed in response to Jonathan's death. Meeting minutes showed him suggesting additional lighting in the parking lot and offering to install it himself at cost, potentially removing evidence that might have remained at the scene. Most disturbingly, he had maintained relationships with Jonathan's family. Former co-workers recalled him attending Melissa Robinson's high school graduation party in 1994, bringing a gift and telling stories about working with her father. For years, he had sent Christmas cards to Susan Kaufman, formerly Robinson, signing them, "Your Firefly family is always here for you." It was almost as if he wanted to stay close to the aftermath of his crime, Sheriff Custer observed, not out of remorse, but almost like he was monitoring the impact, watching the ripple effects of what he'd done. The investigative team also examined the suspect's life after the murder. In 1989, he had married a woman who worked in the Firefly's accounting department. They had no children. His performance reviews showed consistent, if unspectacular, work until his retirement in 2015. He had no criminal record beyond a 1997 DUI that resulted in probation and a fine. By all outward appearances, he had lived a normal, quiet life in the very community where he had committed murder. He volunteered at the local food bank, belonged to a bowling league, and attended community events regularly. Neighbors described him as helpful, keeps to himself, and always has that workshop light on late into the night. That workshop, located in a detached garage behind his home, became a point of interest. Tax records showed he had built it in 1990, obtaining all proper permits. Former co-workers mentioned his passion for woodworking and knife-making, a hobby he had developed in the years after Jonathan's murder. With the DNA match confirmed and a comprehensive profile developed, the investigative team secured search and arrest warrants on April 7, 2022. The warrants detailed not only the genetic evidence, but the suspect's connections to the victim, his knowledge of Jonathan's schedule, his medical training relevant to the sedative used, and his access to the murder scene. Early the next morning, a tactical team surrounded the suspect's ranch-style home on Sycamore Street. At precisely 6:15 a.m., officers announced their presence and ordered him to exit with hands visible. After a tense 2 minutes, the front door opened and the killer of Jonathan Robinson finally faced justice. The man who stepped onto his porch, blinking in confusion at the officers with weapons drawn, looked nothing like a murderer. At 63, he had thinning gray hair, glasses, and the slight paunch of a retiree. Dressed in pajama pants and a faded T-shirt, he raised his hands slowly, asking repeatedly, "What is this about?" There must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. Science had spoken with absolute certainty. The killer had been hiding in plain sight for 3.5 decades, believing his secret safe forever. Now handcuffed in his own driveway, the facade of normalcy was finally crumbling. This case took a shocking turn that nobody expected. Comment below with your theories before we reveal the truth. Who do you think this unassuming maintenance supervisor really was? And what drove him to murder Jonathan Robinson on that snowy February night? What secrets do you think investigators found inside his workshop? Share your thoughts, and in our next segment we'll reveal the full stunning truth about the man who thought he had committed the perfect crime. The arrest of Richard Thornton required meticulous planning. Despite his age and unassuming appearance, the tactical team treated him as a potentially dangerous suspect. After all, he had allegedly committed a calculated, premeditated murder and successfully evaded justice for decades. "We couldn't afford any mistakes," Lieutenant James Hartman explained. "This wasn't just about making an arrest. It was about ensuring officer safety, preserving evidence, and providing closure for the Robinson family." Planning began immediately after the DNA match confirmation. A 12-person team assembled at the Sheriff's Department on April 7, 2022, including representatives from the Illinois State Police Tactical Unit, Effingham County deputies, and the state's attorney's office. For 6 hours they mapped every detail of the operation. Intelligence gathered during surveillance provided crucial information. Thornton lived alone. His wife, having passed in 2017, owned multiple registered firearms including a .30 L6 hunting rifle and 2 handguns, and typically rose early. Lights in his kitchen usually came on around 5:30 a.m. The team decided on a pre-dawn operation to maximize the element of surprise. They would establish a perimeter at 5L, monitor the home for activity, and initiate contact at 6:15 a.m. after Thornton would likely be awake, but before he would leave for his usual Thursday breakfast at Martin's Diner. Simultaneously, 2 separate teams would execute search warrants on Thornton's detached workshop and his vehicle. Digital forensic specialists would stand by to examine any electronic devices found, while evidence technicians would process the scenes. At 4:45 a.m. on April 8, 2022, the operation began under cover of darkness. Tactical officers took position around Thornton's modest ranch house on Sycamore Street. Neighbors were not evacuated, a calculated risk to avoid alerting the suspect, but officers were stationed to ensure civilian safety if the situation escalated. At 5:22 a.m., lights appeared in Thornton's kitchen, confirming he was awake. Officers observed his silhouette moving from room to room through partially drawn blinds. At exactly 6:15 a.m., the tactical commander gave the go-ahead. Richard Thornton boomed a voice over the loudspeaker. "This is the Effingham County Sheriff's Department. We have a warrant for your arrest. Exit through the front door with your hands visible. Do not bring any weapons for nearly 2 minutes." Described by Detective Blackwell as the longest of my career. There was no response. Officers tensed, prepared for either a confrontation or a barricaded suspect situation. Then, unexpectedly, the front door opened. Richard Thornton, dressed in pajama pants and a faded t-shirt, stepped onto his porch. His expression registered confusion rather than fear or guilt. He raised his hands slowly, squinting without his glasses at the officers surrounding his property. "What is this about?" he asked repeatedly. There must be some mistake. Tactical officers secured him immediately, placing him in handcuffs while clearly stating the Miranda warnings. As he was led to a waiting patrol car, the reality of the situation seemed to dawn on him. According to officers present, his demeanor shifted from confusion to resignation in an instant. "His whole body just slumped," said Deputy Maria Rodriguez, who assisted with the arrest. "It was like watching someone deflate, like he'd been carrying this weight for 35 years and suddenly couldn't hold it anymore." Inside Thornton's home, search teams made a disturbing discovery. In a locked gun safe in the basement, officers found a box containing newspaper clippings about Jonathan Robinson's murder. Every article published over 35 years, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Beneath these was Jonathan's employee ID badge from the Firefly, an item never listed as missing because no one knew he had it with him that night. The search of the detached workshop yielded additional evidence: a collection of hunting knives similar to the murder weapon, a medical kit containing syringes, though no controlled substances, and a hand-drawn map of the Firefly parking lot from 1987 with Jonathan's parking space clearly marked. By 8:30 a.m., as Thornton was being processed at the Effingham County Jail, news of the arrest began spreading through the community. Sheriff Coaster had deliberately waited until the operation was complete before notifying key individuals, including Susan Kaufman and her daughters, Melissa and Rebecca. "I'll never forget that phone call," Melissa Robinson Thomas recounted later. 35. The sheriff said, "We got him, Melissa. We finally got him. I dropped to my knees right there in my kitchen." At 11:00 a.m., Sheriff Coaster held a press conference on the steps of the courthouse. National and regional media had already descended on Effingham, alerted by police scanners and local sources. With Detective Blackwell, State's Attorney Wilson, and representatives from the Illinois State Police flanking him, Coaster announced the arrest. Today I can report that Richard Thornton, age 63 of Effingham, has been arrested for the 1987 murder of Jonathan Robinson. Through advanced DNA technology and diligent police work, we have connected Mr. Thornton to evidence from the original crime scene with absolute scientific certainty. The announcement sent shockwaves through Effingham. Thornton wasn't an outsider or drifter. He was a long-time resident who had been active in the community for decades. People had invited him into their homes, worked alongside him, trusted him. "I just can't believe it," said Frank Doster, former supervisor at the Firefly, now 81. Richard carried John's casket at the funeral. He helped raise money for those girls' education fund. All these years right in front of us, local news outlets quickly assembled profiles of Thornton, interviewing neighbors and acquaintances. The portrait that emerged was disturbingly ordinary. A quiet man who kept his lawn manicured, waved to neighbors, and occasionally brought his famous peon pie to community potlucks. That's what makes it so unsettling, psychologist Dr. Helen Franks told the Effingham Daily News. We expect monsters to look like monsters, but the reality is that someone capable of calculating a murder can also be capable of maintaining a normal facade for decades. Social media exploded with locals sharing their connections to Thornton. A Facebook group titled, "I Knew Richard Thornton" gained over 2,000 members within hours, with posts ranging from shock to retroactive suspicion. One commenter wrote, "Always thought there was something off about him. Too interested in the Robinson case whenever it came up." At 2 p.m. on April 9th, Thornton made his first court appearance, wearing an orange jumpsuit and looking considerably older than his 63 years. He stood before Judge Marshall Clayton for formal charging. First-degree murder with special circumstance of lying in wait. The courtroom was packed with members of the Robinson family occupying the front row. Susan Kaufman, now 65, stared unwaveringly at the man who had allegedly killed her first husband and sent her life on an entirely different trajectory. When asked how he pled, Thornton spoke for the first time publicly, "Not guilty." His court-appointed attorney requested bail. A motion State's Attorney Wilson vehemently opposed. The defendant evaded justice for 35 years, she argued. He has every reason to flee now that science has conclusively tied him to this calculated murder. Judge Clayton agreed, ordering Thornton held without bail pending trial. As he was led from the courtroom, Rebecca Robinson, who had been just 8 when her father was killed, stood up. "Look at me," she said clearly, drawing Thornton's reluctant gaze. "I've wondered about your face my entire life." Thornton looked away quickly, but those present described the moment as electric, a daughter finally confronting the man allegedly responsible for her father's death. After a lifetime of questions as April progressed, the case against Richard Thornton continued to build. The DNA evidence provided a foundation, but investigators worked tirelessly to establish the complete narrative of what had happened on that February night in 1987 and why a maintenance supervisor had decided Jonathan Robinson needed to die. As Richard Thornton sat in the Effingham County jail, investigators continued building their case, working to connect the physical evidence with human motivation. The DNA match had answered the who, but the why remained crucial for prosecutors preparing for trial. The professional relationship between Thornton and Robinson proved central to establishing motive. Though they weren't direct colleagues, Robinson in fabrication, Thornton in maintenance, their paths crossed daily at the Firefly. As maintenance supervisor, Thornton was responsible for keeping Robinson's equipment operational, creating a natural dependency that placed Thornton in a service role to the younger man. Their dynamic was revealing, explained Dr. Marsha Winters, a forensic psychologist consulting on the case. Thornton had technical expertise and seniority, yet organizationally, he served at the pleasure of production supervisors like Robinson. For someone with deep-seated insecurity, that arrangement could breed resentment. Interviews with former Firefly employees confirmed friction between the two men. Marcus Thompson recalled, John would get frustrated when equipment broke down because it affected his production targets. He'd press Richard to fix things faster. Richard would get defensive about his department being understaffed and underappreciated. Frank Doster, who supervised both departments, provided crucial context. Richard applied for promotion to operations manager in 1984 and again in 1985. Both times he was passed over because while technically skilled, he lacked people management abilities. Jonathan, meanwhile, was a natural leader who advanced quickly despite being younger and having less seniority. The Springfield job offer to Robinson in late 1986 appeared to be the breaking point. Personnel records revealed Thornton had applied for the same position just 2 months earlier and been rejected. The official reason, better suited to technical role than corporate environment, likely struck Thornton as yet another dismissal of his ambitions. In Thornton's mind, Robinson became the embodiment of his professional failures. Detective Blackwell theorized, each of Robinson's successes reinforced Thornton's sense of being overlooked and unvalued. This theory gained credibility when investigators discovered a performance improvement plan in Thornton's file from November 1986, just 3 months before the murder. The document, signed by both Thornton and his supervisor, cited inappropriate communications with production staff and difficulty accepting feedback from colleagues. It required him to complete an anger management course. The workshop search yielded Thornton's personal journal from that period, containing entries that prosecutors would later describe as a roadmap to murder. While never explicitly mentioning violence, the entries documented growing obsession. November 15, 1986, J.R. given Springfield job today. Youngest person ever promoted to headquarters. Meanwhile, I'm told I'm too valuable in maintenance to transfer. 14 years here counts for nothing. December 3, 1986, Junior strutting around like he owns the place. Heard him on phone with girlfriend, talking about house hunting in Springfield. All smiles and congratulations, while I'm fixing the same broken ventilation system for 3rd time this month. January 22, 1987. Overheard Junior might be turning down Springfield to stay near his kids. Unbelievable. Handed opportunity of a lifetime and doesn't even want it. Some people don't deserve what they're given. February 16, 1987, Junior working late Wednesday. Perfect timing since new shipment arriving Thursday needs prep. We'll finally have answers. That last entry, written just 2 days before the murder, suggested premeditation. It aligned with maintenance records showing Thornton had indeed scheduled himself for evening work on February 18th, the night Robinson was killed. Based on physical evidence and Thornton's known skills, investigators reconstructed the likely sequence of events. Thornton, aware of Robinson's late work schedule that night, prepared by bringing both a syringe filled with sedative, likely obtained through his EMT connections, and a hunting knife from his personal collection. He signed out at 10:00 p.m., but instead of leaving, apparently waited in his truck in the far corner of the parking lot. Security camera footage re-examined with modern enhancement techniques showed a vehicle matching Thornton's 1985 Ford F-150 parked near the dumpsters from approximately 10:15 p.m. until after midnight. The grain equality prevented absolute identification, but the shape and position aligned with witness statements about Thornton's usual parking habits. When Robinson exited the building at 11:42 p.m., Thornton likely watched him walk to his car and begin clearing snow from the windshield. The cigarette butt found at the scene, now conclusively tied to Thornton through DNA, suggested he smoked while waiting, perhaps to calm his nerves. The reconstruction theorized that Thornton approached Robinson under the pretense of a work-related question, used the syringe to inject him with sedative, then waited for it to take effect. Once Robinson was incapacitated, Thornton stabbed him multiple times and dragged his body behind the dumpsters, where it would be partially concealed by snow and garbage collections scheduled for the next morning. Thornton then took Robinson's employee ID, perhaps as a trophy, and left, confident the snowfall would cover evidence of the crime. What he couldn't have anticipated was that the cigarette butt he discarded would preserve his DNA for decades, eventually betraying him when science caught up with his crime. It was remarkably calculated for someone with no criminal history. Sheriff Custer noted he chose a night with heavy snow, used his legitimate work access as cover, and selected a method, sedation followed by stabbing, that minimized noise and struggle. Without DNA technology, he might never have been caught. Despite the substantial evidence assembled against Thornton, several questions remained unanswered. First, how did Thornton obtain the sedative? The autopsy had identified it as a powerful benzodiazepine, typically available only through medical prescription. Thornton's EMT training gave him knowledge of such drugs, but not necessarily access. Investigation into his medical connections continued, with focus on several former Firefly employees who had worked in healthcare. Second, did anyone help Thornton or have knowledge of his plans? While the evidence pointed to him acting alone, certain aspects like moving Robinson's body would have been physically challenging for one person. Investigators continued examining Thornton's personal relationships from that period, particularly focusing on his then-girlfriend, later wife, who had worked in the Firefly's accounting department. Third, had there been warning signs others missed? Beyond the documented workplace tensions, investigators sought to determine if Thornton had displayed concerning behaviors that might have alerted colleagues or supervisors to his potential for violence. This question had implications not just for the Robinson case, but for workplace safety protocols more broadly. Perhaps most disturbing was the question of whether Jonathan's murder was Thornton's only violent crime. Detective Blackwell initiated reviews of unsolved cases in areas where Thornton had lived or traveled, looking for similar signatures, sedation, stabbing, seemingly motiveless attacks. When someone successfully conceals a murder for 35 years, you have to wonder if there were others, Blackwell explained. Thornton regularly traveled to hunting areas in Wisconsin and Michigan, were coordinating with agencies in those regions to review cold cases with similar characteristics. As the prosecution prepared for trial, scheduled for early 2023, the most personal questions came from Jonathan's family. Rebecca Robinson had been just 8 when her father was killed. Now 43 with children of her own, she struggled to comprehend how someone who had attended her father's funeral, who had watched her grow up from afar, could have been responsible for her family's devastation. "The hardest part isn't just that he killed my dad," she told reporters. "It's that he looked us in the eyes for years afterward. He saw what his actions did to our family, and he said nothing." How does someone live with that? It was a question only Richard Thornton could answer. And as he awaited trial, he maintained his silence, speaking only through his court-appointed attorney, who continued to assert his innocence despite the DNA evidence. For 36 years, the Robinson family lived with an open wound, a tragedy without resolution, questions without answers, and grief without closure. The arrest of Richard Thornton in April 2022 didn't just represent justice. It marked a seismic shift in their understanding of their own history. When Sheriff Custer called, "I couldn't process it at first," Susan Kaufman recounted, sitting in her living room, surrounded by photos of her daughters and grandchildren. "After decades of disappointment, you train yourself not to hope." But he said those words I'd stopped believing I'd ever hear. We know who killed Jonathan. Susan had rebuilt her life after Jonathan's murder, remarrying in 1989, running a successful local business, and focusing on giving her daughter stability. But the unsolved case had cast a long shadow over these achievements. For years I'd scanned faces in the grocery store, wondering if I was looking at Jonathan's killer, she explained, her voice steady from years of practiced composure. I'd analyze every interaction we'd had before his death, searching for clues we might have missed. Learning it was Richard, someone who'd been at our wedding, who'd held my daughters as babies. It was like being victimized all over again. For Melissa and Rebecca Robinson, the arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions. Now 46 and 43 respectively, both had built lives marked by the absence of their father. Melissa became an advocate for victims' rights, while Rebecca pursued a career in criminal psychology, choices directly influenced by their family tragedy. I was 10 when Dad was killed, Melissa shared during an interview at her Chicago home. Old enough to remember him vividly, young enough that those memories became somewhat frozen in time. The hardest part was knowing someone took him from us deliberately, and that person was just living their life. Rebecca, who had been 8 in 1987, struggled with different demons. I barely remember Dad's voice anymore. What I remember clearly is the aftermath. Mom crying when she thought we were asleep, moving to a smaller house, the whispers at school. My entire identity formed around being the girl whose father was murdered. Both sisters were present for Thornton's arraignment, sitting stoically as they faced their father's alleged killer for the first time with full knowledge of his actions. I expected to feel hatred, Rebecca admitted. Instead, I felt pity mixed with disgust. This unremarkable man had destroyed our family over professional jealousy. He'd stolen our father, our security, our normal childhood, and for what? It seemed so pathetically small compared to what we'd lost. The revelation that the killer had been hiding in plain sight, attending community events, watching the girls grow up from a distance, added a disturbing dimension to their processing. Richard sent me a graduation card when I finished high school, Melissa revealed, her voice tight with controlled anger. Knowing now that he'd watched me graduate while being responsible for my father missing that milestone, it's beyond comprehension. For Jonathan's mother, Margaret Robinson, now 92 and in assisted living, the arrest came almost too late. While mentally sharp, her health had declined significantly. When told about Thornton's arrest, she reportedly held her nurse's hand and whispered, "I always knew they'd find him before I died." As the family prepared for trial, they focused on finding meaning in their decades-long wait for justice. They established the Jonathan Robinson Memorial Scholarship for students entering trade professions, honoring Jonathan's skill as a craftsman. They also began speaking at victim advocacy events, sharing their unique perspective on long-term grief and the importance of cold case investigation. The arrest didn't heal everything, Susan acknowledged. Those 36 years can't be given back. The girls' childhoods without their father can't be restored. But knowing the truth matters. Not having to wonder anymore matters. Rebecca, who now has 3 children of her own, perhaps summarized it most poignantly. For most of my life, Dad's story ended with a question mark. Now it ends with a period. It's not a happy ending. Nothing could make this story happy, but it's complete. There's peace in that completeness, even amid the sadness. Dad deserved that much, at least for his story to be finished properly. As the trial date approached, the Robinson family faced one final challenge, hearing the full details of Jonathan's final moments, yet they would face this together, strengthened by the knowledge that after 36 years of darkness, the truth had finally come to light. Effingham, Illinois transformed fundamentally in February 1987. A community where residents routinely left doors unlocked suddenly found itself grappling with an unfamiliar emotion: fear. Before Jonathan's murder, this was a place where everybody knew everybody, explained Dorothy Weber, 83, who has lived in Effingham her entire life. Afterward, we started looking at each other differently. Suspicion crept into ordinary interactions. The initial shock manifested in visible changes around town. Hardware stores reported unprecedented sales of deadbolts and security systems. Parents began accompanying children to activities previously considered safe. The Firefly manufacturing facility, once a symbol of local prosperity, took on darker associations. For years I'd drive past that parking lot and slow down, almost like paying respects at a cemetery, said Pastor Thomas Whitfield, whose congregation included several Firefly employees. We all did it. It became this unconscious ritual, acknowledging that something had broken in our community. Perhaps most telling was how the case divided Effingham's timeline into distinct eras before and after the Robinson murder. Local history books referenced events as happening 2 years before the Robinson case, or a decade after the murder. It became the town's defining tragedy. When Richard Thornton's arrest was announced in 2022, the community experienced collective whiplash. The killer hadn't been an outsider or drifter, but someone who had remained embedded in local life for decades. "I bought fishing gear from Richard at the hardware store for 20 years, said James Emily, 67, shaking his head in disbelief. "My kids went to school with his nieces and nephews. Finding out he was capable of murder, it makes you question everything you think you know about people." For newer residents, the case's resolution offered a window into Effingham's complex history. Sarah Lawson, who moved to town in 2010, described watching the community process the news. It was like witnessing a town-wide therapy session. People who never talked about the case suddenly couldn't stop discussing it, sharing memories, connecting dots from decades ago. Police Chief Daniel Harrison, who was just 7 years old when Robinson was killed, noted how the case influenced local law enforcement practices. "Every officer in this department grew up hearing about the Robinson murder. It shaped our commitment to evidence preservation and cold case review. We learned that justice might be delayed, but with proper procedures it's never impossible." Perhaps the most profound lesson emerged from how the community had unwittingly harbored a killer. The revelation forced residents to reconsider the balance between small-town trust and necessary vigilance. "We don't want to lose what makes Effingham special, that sense of community and connection," observed Mayor Caroline Phillips. But Richard Thornton's case reminds us that appearances can be deceiving. The neighbor who seems perfectly ordinary might harbor unimaginable secrets. As Effingham continues processing this chapter of its history, many residents express hope that other communities might learn from their experience. Preserve evidence meticulously, never give up on cold cases, and remember that time doesn't diminish a family's need for answers. 36 years feels like forever, reflected Frank Doster, the former Firefly supervisor. But for the Robinson family, the pain was as fresh on day 13,000 as it was on day 1. That's something every community dealing with unsolved crimes needs to remember. Richard Thornton's trial began in January 2023, with prosecutors presenting the DNA evidence as their cornerstone. After 7 days of testimony, including emotional statements from the Robinson family and forensic experts detailing the genetic genealogy breakthrough, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts. In March 2023, Thornton was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. For cold case investigators nationwide, the Robinson case represents a beacon of hope. It demonstrates how evidence preserved during an era of limited technology can speak volumes decades later, when science finally catches up. The cigarette butt that sat in evidence storage for 36 years, seemingly insignificant in 1987, ultimately became the key that unlocked justice. This case also underscores why departments should never fully abandon unsolved murders, regardless of time past. From Detective Walsh's meticulous initial investigation to Detective Blackwell's innovative application of genetic genealogy, the chain of dedication spanned generations of law enforcement professionals. Perhaps most significantly, the Robinson case reminds us of the power of perseverance, both from investigators who refused to let the case die and from a family who never stopped seeking answers. Their journey illustrates that while justice delayed may not be ideal, it remains infinitely preferable to justice denied. For the Robinson family, no verdict or sentence could restore the decades lost or heal every wound inflicted by Jonathan's murder. But in solving this case, a community found closure. Science vindicated patience, and a killer finally faced the consequences of that snowy night in 1987. This case shows that justice can come even after decades of waiting. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another solved cold case on Revealed Crime Cases. Every cold case solved brings closure to families who have waited far too long for answers, and reminds criminals that time doesn't erase their crime.